The voices told us that we are now being recorded for posterity. Clapping, clapping, clapping for all the spirits. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Here we are, Underworld Party again. This is part of a mini series that I'm calling Beyond Land Acknowledgement because I want to get people mad at that. And I have the pleasure today, the honor, the privilege, the joy of interviewing someone I've wanted to interview for a while, Peter Michael Bauer of Rewilding. And we're going to get into it, and I don't want to delay. Peter, welcome to the Underworld Party.
Thank
How
you
you
for having
doing?
me. I'm doing all
Yeah,
right.
yeah. I want to talk to you. Other people mention you in the podcast sometimes as people they look up to. So I was like, I always try to find where people sort of fit into the scheme of like what I'm interested in and what I'm sort of like curating, and then um, you'll be like I think the third interview in this series that I'm doing over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. That's called Beyond Land Acknowledgement, and it kind of is exactly what it sounds like. Like I want to talk about lots of things, but I also want to talk about what does it mean to not just do this kind of weird, oh, I acknowledge the land and we're on unceded territory kind of thing, but like to actually, live differently, relate differently. So that's part of what I'm trying to talk about. And also, you've been doing this for a fucking while.
It's true.
You've been
It's
doing this
true.
for a while. How long has it been?
I
Since
mean, it depends on what you mean by this,
yeah,
but
totally.
for me, I dropped out of high school, ran away from home when I was 16 to at the time, what I was believing I was doing was going to learn wilderness survival so I could form a quote unquote tribe and go live in the wilderness to survive the collapse of civilization,
Oh
right?
yeah, that's a great little dream. I like
And
that.
that was in 1998. So, yeah. I wouldn't use that language anymore. No longer do I even believe that those things are possible. But it's been a long journey. But yeah.
Great. Well, the journey is long and it continues and we get older, and that's the sort of the funniness about life is that like we have all these hot shot dreams of
Totally.
idealism and salvation when we're younger, and then we realize that like salvation is being able to sleep whenever you want.
Yeah, for real.
And not just be tied down to some crazy
Hmm.
corporate 9 to 5. So it's
Hmm.
really I do think that like, I look at the so-called youth movements, or maybe not even youth movements, but like really idealistic sort of movements that we could label under weird, I don't know, what are they even like? Are they neo-animists? Like what the fuck? Like they're just like coming up with new hybrid names
Right.
all the time,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
But I do feel the kind of like when I look at a lot of the movements around what we're talking about, there's like these two camps, and one camp is like lots of energy, like lots of like, but like lots of intensity. Let's just call it
Mm.
intensity, like the intensity of like urgency
Mm.
and kind of like being fed up and like having a lot of catharsis and rage and also like grief and like a lot of intensity and a lot of I mean to me it looks like exhaustion, but there's a
Mm.
lot of like intense mobilization. And then there's these other sort of quieter, less celebritized perhaps movements that are actually just about like I don't know, living and dying in a calm way
Hmm.
as much as you can, right? Live.
Totally.
And yeah, I'd like to. What are you noticing in the sort of field right now that is interesting to you, or even if it's not interesting, that you're just like, oh, I'm noticing some stuff going on.
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that because I just yesterday I've been slowly reading through my book Rewild or Die, doing like an audio version of it and updating, the thoughts that I had 15 years ago when I wrote it to what it is like now. And yesterday I recorded this chapter called Appropriation versus Rewilding that was maybe like 2 pages long and is 15 years old. And then instead of just leaving it at that, I wanted to also read this very much longer essay that I wrote years later, about 6 or 7 years ago now, called Cultural Appropriation and Rewilding. And it was just funny how, like, even that is like, way more in depth than this other thing I wrote. But even that is like so outdated for the moment in terms of, like, I think what you're saying, this sort of like urgency, exhaustion, um, versus this sort of quiet thing, and it's interesting to kind of be somebody who I feel like I skirt the line between those. I'm somebody that my friends are jokingly, say that I'm like one of the most angsty people they've ever met or whatever, right? Compliment, but there's like limitations to angst, right? So you have to like counterbalance that with sort of like your whatever peacefulness or acceptance and these different things that come along with um, just living in reality. That angst is not something that works all the time. It's like and I feel like I've over my course of my life learned to channel it appropriatively. I'm not a master at that in any way at all. But I feel like I have a sort of a better handle on it. The more that I age, the more I learn about myself, and the more routines and habits and things like that I can build to kind of um, just understanding myself and being able to move forward in the world and make a better impact. But like reading that essay was like just kind of thinking about how I think at the end of the essay, it's like, just like listen and be cool and, just make friends with people and blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, wow, this is so outdated because like the level of animosity that exists now in, social justice is just like so deep. And it just, I just want to like go back to that, that 7 years ago and tell myself like fucking buckle up, dude. Like you buckle up. You think this is gonna be easy? No, it's not. And so yeah, I'm just kind of in this interesting place now where there's so much contention around trying to make different impacts, and people believing that if you're not following some larger party line, that you're worthless or you're just straight up wrong or whatever. So it's really been hard to kind of grapple with diversity of tactics and diversity of understanding and how to link those together. And that's kind of what I've been thinking about a lot lately. In particular, this idea of quote unquote cancel culture, and its origins coming from potentially right-wing people who are annoyed that their ideas are being shut down or that there's maybe ad hominem attacks against them for their ideas.
Yeah.
And then the left rejecting that as like abuse apology or these different things, rather than like having that also be a time for self-reflection or a reflection of maybe this angst on this mass scale of where we are engaging in campaigns of harassment against people and punitive justice, and I just also finished Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta, and there's that whole, I don't know if it's actually from that book or I immediately listened to his interview on the For the Wild podcast, so I'm not sure which part of it came from because it was an audio book. So
Totally.
but one of the things that he was talking about was that in their culture, like if you do something wrong, you go through this process and then they just forgive you and all is forgiven, right? And it's almost impossible for me to even imagine that. Totally. Even not just like how I would like to be forgiven, but me forgiving other people. Like it's such a deep thing in my head that like once a person has wronged me or I've felt wronged, it's like almost impossible for me to let it go.
Totally. And I mean, I think about this stuff a lot too, because it's like part of the sort of mystical path that I follow is a kind of like, can we actually let go of our karmas in one lifetime, right? Could we actually and it's not just my karma, it's like the things I've done, but also the things that my ancestors have done to sort of put me in positions.
Totally.
Right?
Yep.
It's like it's a long line of consequences and behaviors and accidents and all sorts of stuff, right? But the interesting thing about Tyson, because me and Jeremy and Larissa did like a 4 episode kind of podcast session about the book, like a book club kind of thing, and it's that like Tyson's culture has a sense of like everyone belongs to the land together. So the trust that they have is not actually individualized. Whereas in this culture, people talk all the time about like I don't feel safe or I don't trust you. And there's a whole line of justifications about that, right? Like I don't trust you because you said this word, or you don't understand anti-blackness enough, or and for me, I'm like, okay, I can hear those. I mean, like everyone's got an opinion, and they're all kind of valid, and so I'm not trying to take it personally. But what I can see is that like people are trying to hold these large conceptual energy fields like trust and justice inside an individual framework.
Totally.
And it can't
Right.
possibly work because justice is actually something like the river flooding every season. That's
Hmm.
actually justice. Justice is not making the Mississippi River straight so that we could have some kind of order, so that then we have an idea that like justice is that the river doesn't flood anymore.
Totally. Yes.
And I think that those consequences are sort of subsumed in the deep subconscious past, so that we now think that injustice is like, um, I didn't get my opinion was not like revered, or like my preferences are being touched in a way that I don't like, or like my consent is being violated by the rainstorm.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm. Hmm.
there's a reality to like we've been so divorced from both community, but not just community, human to human, human to land.
Yeah.
And because of that, we can't sort of like get over our grudges very easily, because the grudging getting over is like a ritual, like
Totally.
like
Yes.
going on a fasting quest, or like sitting in a cave for like 2 weeks because that's just what you do sometimes.
Hmm.
That's when like these grudges release into the ether and we go, wow, I just got healed. It's like, yeah, because you sat underneath that fucking tree that's like 500 years old. It's not really like a
Hmm.
human choice to get rid of these grudges or these betrayals or whatever. And we've lost that so much that when Tyson talks about this thing, we're kind of gobsmacked by both the simplicity and our distance from that simplicity,
Hmm.
you
Totally.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's like a level of um, everything being held in suspension. I think this is one of the things that feels the most frustrating for me is that it feels like our culture, like your metaphor of a straight river, like making the river straight. It's like there's this level of fixed reality that doesn't want the changing flow of the river. It wants everything to be stay the same. And we're in this like fixed state that is preventing us from actually following through and figuring out all of these things. And as soon as that dam breaks, the flow gets, quote unquote, wild again. And I think that we will have a pretty rapid return to those kinds of relationships. And what's frustrating for me, though, is that I don't see people trying to break that dam. I see them trying to create different dams, if
Yeah,
that makes sense. You know what I mean?
totally. Yeah,
And
no,
it's this idea of like seeing like a state,
mhm.
instead of dismantling the whole structure, which might seem improbable or impossible. It's
Right.
just inverting the structure or creating a similar structure that serves other people and oppresses another people.
Well, yeah, I mean, like we internalize, not just internalize, but like what that means is that we learn to sense based on the conditions or the bodies around us that are sort of like pressuring us into certain ways of being. And when we're not looking to like nature, the seasons, the sun, the moon, the stars as like teachers, like actually trying to tell us like, oh, you don't even know how to walk, you don't know how to look, you don't know how to hear, like this is how you hear. hear like the bird hears, hear like the raven hears, like move like the tiger moves. You know, these are very
Mm-hmm.
bullshit metaphors I'm making up right now. But the point being is that like if you spend time with the land as a being that is actually modeling a way of living, rather it's not an object, it's not a commodity. It's an ecosystem that is behaving. It is behaving in certain ways. You can see it move. You can see it listen or react. You can see it,
Totally.
you feel it, and those are to many older cultures. That's the teaching. Like we're not actually like the elders are really basically saying, "Did you look at the?" You know, the elders are kind of like pointing back, like I'm just trying to translate. Like the elders are trying to translate nature into something that a baby or a teenager could understand in human language, but they're not pretending that they're just like, I'm just trying to live like the mountain, buddy, you know? And what we have today is like people actually are the condition or the ecosystem that they're in is statehood or
Mm-hmm.
colonialism. But the funny thing about that is people aren't even naming it as such.
Right. Exactly.
They're not really saying, "Oh, I my ecosystem is a capitalistic statehood that is teaching me how to perceive."
Right.
They're
Exactly.
actually invisibilized that so that they think that they're just like normal. They're just like, "Oh, this is the way to see." And you know, part of the remediation, I think that what I'm doing is I'm saying like, no, if you want to use a pithy, stupid metaphor, we have to decolonize our sensations. We have to decolonize the way that we're sensing because most people come in and they're like, oh, trauma, trauma. I don't like the way I feel. I don't like what's going on. And it's like, yeah, because the root of that is that you don't even know how to like listen in a way that isn't hurting yourself or perceive language in a way that isn't like immediately categorizing things into little boxes. So like,
Right.
of course, if your decision making process, which is based on your senses, is completely colonized and civilized, of course you're going to be depressed. Like it's almost like a non-issue. It's like a
Absolutely.
non-confusion
Yeah.
to me, you know?
It makes me think too about well, just the topic of beyond land acknowledgments. You know, land acknowledgments are essentially a function of state thinking. You know, it's
Yeah,
like
totally.
uh it's non-relational, you know. So there's this interesting thing that's going on where it's a spectrum of um extreme like it's hard to put into words. You know,
Yeah, totally.
we've been doing land acknowledgments for a long time, and you know, people are like, well, "What's the point of that?" You know, and so then that's a great dialogue. Like, yeah, what is the point of it? Because this is the state. You know, is it a step toward land back? You know, and then what is land back? I've seen land back be, you know, I've seen memes and little quips and everything from the state honoring the treaties. I mean, I think that's actually how it started, was just honor the treaties, right? Which is again this sort of like, you know, in a sense, pleading to a state government for rights, which is state thinking still. It's still like living in this box of statism.
Yeah.
That's not to say that that's a negative thing at all. It's potentially the only way to, while a state exists, get the resources that a community needs. So having this identity and fighting for rights for that identity is how states function. So it makes sense that that's what people are doing. But I think what we're trying to do is go beyond state societies, is to recognize, and in part because we recognize that it's collapsing, right? So there's this weird dichotomy that's happening where you have people fighting within the state system for their rights, but simultaneously another group of people who are like, this whole thing is bullshit and it's going to not exist pretty soon.
Right.
Like land back to me makes perfect sense, and I'm an advocate for it because I recognize that the state is in its existence right now. And so whatever people can do to fight for their land within the state framework. And yet at the same time, when the state loses its monopoly on violence during collapse, there is no land rights. No one owns anything. Who owns what is going to be controlled by a whole complexity of factors, including where you are, like the localities, You know, there there could be egalitarian, depending on geography and resources. There could be egalitarian cultures that emerge. There could be hierarchical cults. You know, there could be a whole new crop of things, right? And so I think that there's this weird thing that's going on where we're both living in a state controlled environment, but dreaming and envisioning this thing that's going to exist outside of that. And so having to hold multiple complexities at the same time is super challenging, especially because within the state's framework, competition is the central function of
That's
the
right.
state.
That's right.
And so you have like competing identities, right? Which is why
Yes.
it makes sense that everybody's like creating deeper and deeper micro identities, because that's how you gain resources within a state framework that's based on competition. But if we're trying to envision something outside of that, then you have to put that competitiveness aside to dream and to plan. But it's hard to do that when that's the trajectory and that's what it is. It feels like living in the moment, like in the moment here under state control. I have to have this sort of like competitive mindset, you know?
Right.
But at the same time, like, and that's the, to me, that's like the biggest barrier between um, creating coalitions to
Yes.
further social justice
Totally.
outside of the state framework as it collapses. You know, that the biggest barrier is that we actually live under state rule in
That's
the
right.
moment. And in the moment, it's all about competition.
That's right. That's
And so
right.
there has to be like a bridge. There has to be people who see this happening, who can put the angst of the moment aside, who can recognize that the angst that they experience is a momentary thing that that is going to go away. And what is social justice going to look like as collapse intensifies, right? Like collapse is already happening. So what does it look like as we transition? And I think that that's the main component there, is trying to create a bridge between the competitiveness of living in the moment under state rule and the need for collaboration and dismantling of identities, you know, as the world transforms into something else.
Totally. Yeah, you said a lot of great things there, and I just want to sort of like bathe in it for a while because like these are the cores of what I'm doing and what me and Larissa are doing with animist arts. It's like art or the aesthetic realm is one of the only places left, including theater and media and things that we also know are not that great, but they're part of this kind of artistic human thing, like crafting and art, theater, mask making, all this stuff that kids want to do, like it's just the way it is. But like you can even see it in kids though, because, I worked with kids for probably about 5 years in a movement play format. And you could see this, their inner war between competing for scarce resources, which is designed, which is
Hmm.
based on like a family belief system that is like social threat, ambient social threat, right?
Totally.
Constant ambient
Yes.
social threat, so that you learn how to compete so that you don't starve or something. Like you see that. And then with children, especially, you also see this other, actually more natural and larger energy that usually gets whipped out of a
Hmm.
child in
Hmm.
school, which is consent, consent and consensus based, sort of like democratized play. And I've been reading some things about these you know what happens in hunter gatherer societies who are play based rather than threat based, and it's like play, they say that play is the suppression of dominance.
Mm.
So in order to play well, you have to actually continually suppress, and that means not just me but you too. Like we have to together continually suppress our urge to dominate the other, because the moment we dominate too much, the other person quits and then we're no
Totally.
longer playing.
Yes.
So for me, the core of what animist arts is doing, which includes things like racial justice and trauma healing, is can we nourish the system enough that you can remember what that fucking process is like, right?
Yeah.
Like you can
Yeah.
remember that, like, oh, my defenses just raised up, and within those defenses came an identity that was like trying to protect me, right? Because the identity that we build in this competitive state society is essentially a form of protection.
Absolutely.
And so we can't say to people,
Necessary
yeah,
protection.
it's
Yeah.
necessary. So we
Yeah.
can't say to people, oh, just lose your identity and just, because that's like saying don't wear clothes outside. It doesn't make
Exactly.
sense.
Yeah.
You need warmth and protection.
Totally.
Like it's
Yes.
not smart. So what we have to do is kind of, I think, illuminate, like render transparent, but also reveal these kinds of hidden um, costumes that we're constantly wearing. Like, oh right, I put my identity on when I don't feel safe, actually,
Hmm.
or like I don't want to be dominated, so I do a preemptive strike and I dominate because I don't want to be dominated. And we have to actually illuminate that in a kind of sandbox in which like we can actually go laugh at ourselves to do that, which I think is what like play and theater allow us to do,
Totally.
because like in theater we can pretend to be the cops, and we can
Yeah.
actually go, oh, this is why someone would choose to do this ridiculously harmful thing, because it feels like you're really protected.
Mm.
Like we
Mm.
actually have to give people the chance to play in an like to illuminate something. And of course, I'm not the first person to say this, right? Like theater of the oppressed is doing all this stuff, but I'm just sort of highlighting the fact that like play-based cultures, animist cultures who have a lot of so-called leisure time, I don't think it's leisure time as much as it's sort of like modulating a kind of theatrical playfulness with the land, right?
Totally.
Like how when you see monkeys in the trees, they're not always only just eating or grooming, they're also kind of playing with their environmental condition, right? And I do think that like we are those beings with just a lot more sort of memory about things, and we have to kind of contend with that layer of narrative, right?
Totally.
The story of colonization is in some way both real and a fiction. And,
Absolutely.
and obviously people are going to get angry when they hear that, because but I'm saying it's both.
Right. Yeah.
And like to illuminate this inside oneself is to actually become like scared of one's own imagination,
Totally.
because we go, oh, I kind of am doing this, I'm
Yeah.
kind of like feeding this, you know
Exactly. Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me think too, just in regards to play, in order for us, so that's awesome. I love that. And the theater stuff, it makes me just think of the, if you start dominating, it's no longer fun for the other person. They stop. That's why yes and it was invented for improv, right? Like
Yeah,
you
totally.
don't say no, but you don't like dominate the scene. If somebody comes up with an idea and you incorporate it, right? It's all about like jamming together, not owning it yourself or rejection of the person. So yes um, and I think that in order to really play, we have to have a sense of lightheartedness. You can't come into play necessarily without that sort of lightheartedness. And if you think that, I mean, essentially what the culture of shaming and like cancel culture is essentially that it's saying no, but
Yeah.
right. It's not saying yes and it's like excluding people. And so that makes it really challenging, especially if you can incorporate some of the criticisms, then you can have self-reflection.
Yes.
Even if you don't fully end up or fully agree with the criticisms, like you have to acknowledge that somebody else is experiencing this point of view and this perspective, and
Yes.
an inquiry as to why is it.
Yeah.
Um,
Totally.
and I think there's this moment right now where and I feel like there's definitely like a turn happening, but I don't know where it's going to turn to.
Oh yeah. Sure.
And in terms of like the extremism from like land acknowledgement to land back, like I've seen everything from honor the treaties to every white person needs to move back to Europe, and I'm just like, that is so not going to happen.
Right.
That is an unrealistic reality. You're not existing within reality if you think that
Yeah.
that's going to happen. And that's an absurd thing to think,
Right.
like that. But yes, and yes, I
Right.
understand.
Right.
I
Totally.
understand that pain. I
Yeah.
understand the desire, for that. And so, yes, let's bring that in and also like recognize that that's, that
Totally.
the pain is real and that's never going to happen.
Totally. Right.
And you know,
Right.
let's try to figure out a way to coexist. And what would that look like? I don't know, because right now we have to be competing against each other for resources within this framework.
Yes. Right.
So
Right.
it
Totally.
becomes this stalemate, you know.
Yeah. 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 It's like
Of
it's like catch 22 is a phrase people know, and that's what this is, like a double bind.
totally.
And
Yes.
I call it now a ghost 22 because it's not really a catch. It's like a specter of
Mm-hmm.
our kind of memories of betrayal. And it's not like the land, it's like weird. Mythology is also funny because like you look at myth and you go, oh, you anthropomorphize that the earth betrayed you as a reason to colonize it like both
Right.
agriculturally, but also
Totally.
like it's like beyond agriculture because
Mm-hmm.
agriculture on some level is just horticulture and it's
Totally.
okay to
Yep.
want food,
Sure.
like it's okay.
Absolutely.
But then there's this extra narrative oomph that somehow gets put in the sort of mythological archetypal pile, which is kind of just like a justification for being a dick,
Right. Exactly.
like it's a
Yes.
justification to not collaborate is what I'm
Totally.
saying. It's a justification to go, well, the land is trying to yes and us too, because like on some level, all beings on the land serve some ecosystemic support to that land. Like, it's just
Totally.
obvious. So
Yeah.
humans are not like some separate creature whose poop doesn't feed the soil. It's not like we're pooping radioactive uranium and the land is like, get off my planet. Where'd you
Right.
come from? It's no,
Yeah.
it's completely integrated, right?
Totally.
So there's something that happened in this kind of narrative justification play a long, long time ago in which like we had to invent or fantasize a non-realistic behavioral intention to like Mother Earth or women or gay people or whatever in order to justify not collaborating with them.
Totally. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, to me, that's like how I would essentially define domestication. I know a lot of people, they think of domestication as just being pro-social, right? Like the dog domesticated itself is something that you
Yeah,
classically hear
totally.
because it became pro-social towards humans from eating our trash piles. I'm starting to call dogs trash wolves
Yeah, totally.
or
Yeah,
waste wolves.
yeah,
But yeah, they were wolves who diverged from wolf populations to eat the waste of humans, and because they were close to us, became pro-social. But that's not domestication. Domestication is, I think, what you're talking about. I think it's the point at which you say no but to a dog, not yes and. Like dogs living coexisting with us for tens of thousands of years, that's yes and. We're yes anding each other, right? But
right,
what happens when you put the leash on the dog? What happens when you start intentionally breeding dogs for
right,
characteristics that you want?
right.
That's not a collaborative relationship. That
No,
is a
that's a
bit one based on
domination.
control, right?
Right, right,
And so to me, that's the difference between mutualism and domestication, which a lot of people conflate domestication as like um, you know, any kind of human, non-human relation, or even with humans. Like I read an article also that was like humans domesticated themselves, which is like, again, we became more pro-social,
yeah,
but not necessarily controlling. The thing about being pro-social is that it makes it really easy to then capture somebody and dominate them, right?
yes,
If they're more
right,
pro-social towards you, they get closer. It's easier to put a leash on a dog if it's
yes,
than a wolf, right? But that's just because they're pro-social. But the pro-socialness isn't domestication. It isn't
right,
that domination.
that's right, right. Yeah, and I think it's very important because, we're in this phase of time where a lot of bullshit history is being revealed.
Yes.
Like bullshit theories about things. Like,
Totally.
Graeber and Wengrow have this new
Yeah,
book that everyone
totally.
is
Yep.
kind of
It's right here in
masturbating
front of me
over.
on my
Yeah,
it's right here on my
totally.
desk.
Yeah, yeah,
I just got it in the mail.
totally,
Yeah.
totally. So like everyone is kind of like, having an erotic moment with the kind of
Hmm.
like, ooh, ah. But I just, it's like we're in a process of unweaving some of the narrative spells that our ancestors have sort of cast in order to justify this kind of pro-social domination kind of abuse structure, which is like saying I love you, but really like withholding food from you or something.
Totally.
Like
Yeah.
it's a real like
Yeah.
weird
Totally.
brainwash. It's a psyop technique for sure. It's like it's like a real psyop, you know, you see it in like prisoner of war stuff, you see it in like domestic abuse and childhood abuse situations. It's like there is a way that our ability to craft or create change in an environment is actually a real double-edged sword. You know, it's like
Totally.
I
Yeah.
have the capacity to cooperate, but I also have the capacity to dominate. And if I don't know the difference because no one taught me, I'm going to go with the one that has the like most dopaminergic, like
Mm,
it's not delayed gratification, right?
mm,
It's
mm-hmm.
like instant gratification because
Totally.
domination is instant gratification and cooperation is like, oh, this is going to take a fucking long time. You know, like because to cooperate, you have to build relationships that are like this shared kinship model in which my life and your life are intertwined in ways that are almost unfathomable to describe outside of poetry,
Totally.
right?
Yeah.
Like there's a reality to like the terror of that kind of vulnerability and intimacy, which is not. I think that's the intimacy of the earth, right? It's like the intimacy of the earth is saying you can't escape. You know, like you're actually bonded. We're bonded,
Totally.
and I do think that like initiation rituals, and I'd love to get your take on this, but like initiation rituals are to kind of beautifully or kindly shock people into reckoning with the fact that they hate and love the thing that they are bonded to, right?
Yeah.
Like they hate that they're going to die, but death is the only thing that gives life any kind of meaning.
Totally. Right. Absolutely.
So you have to kind of confront it directly because you actually see the paradoxical emotional state of yourself and kind of have to go, I need to like make art or like I need to do something about this. I need to actually rectify this rift inside myself through a kind of, you know, communal art project, right? Called my life, which is what I think indigenous people do. They're like, oh yeah, when I farm, it's yes, it's for feeding my people, but it's also to like deal with this vision I had when I was 8. You know, it's like it's a whole woven
Totally.
together thing. Like it's not,
Yeah.
it's both practical and deeply mystical and weird and like, what the
Mm-hmm.
hell is going on here? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in sort of like what your organization and how you sort of look at ritual and initiation in this competitive state-based culture because like the minute we place it in that context it also gets weird, right? Because it's not like unconditional love. It's like pass fail kind of shit, you know? And it's
Totally.
like,
Yeah. I mean, I've done, so when I was a teenager, I got, the angsty part of me wants to say swindled. That's a
yeah,
bullshit
totally.
thing. But,
Sure, sure.
I was part of the Tracker School community, which is Tom Brown Jr.'s wilderness survival school in New Jersey. And he has, 20 books
Yeah.
that are made up stories about spiritual training that he received as a child from an Apache shaman who never actually existed. But as a teenager, I believed every word of it, and
Oh
I
yeah,
went
it's a
to his
great book.
school, and I ended up doing a vision quest through that community that was
Yeah.
specifically designed for members of that community.
Yeah.
And as a rite of passage, I was like, I was wanting a rite of passage, I was wanting ritual, and I think it was one of the most damaging experiences that I did in that era for multiple reasons. One is that there was um, because he is actually like the son of a Baptist preacher. He their whole pedagogy or whatever, their whole belief system is based on good and evil, which I am adamantly opposed to the concept of good and evil. Predator prey, sure, but predator prey has no value judgment based on good and evil, right? Um, Fear can be a part of a motivating factor with predator and prey relationships, but good and evil is this sort of thing that can transform depending on the cultural perspective.
Mhm.
And so it it's kind of anyway, I left after a short period of time, and I didn't complete the thing. I basically was like, these people are not my people, and I have to get the hell out of here.
Sure.
That's not to say that I didn't also have an awesome vision
Totally.
during the
Yeah,
vision
totally.
quest, which
Yeah.
was basically, I mean, coming to terms with this with reality, which was
Yeah.
that I was never going to have, like I said at the beginning, I ran away from home to learn wilderness survival to live in a quote unquote tribe in the wilderness, something like the vision quest was basically like, dude, that's never going to happen for you. And you need to grieve about that right now and then
Totally.
fucking do work that is
Yes.
not that.
Yes.
Um, which was super painful and
Oh yeah.
um, challenging for me,
Yeah.
Uh, but it was still an experience that I got, and then but the cultural container for it was terrible, right?
Yes.
Um, then flash forward to a different circumstance. One of my best friends was doing a vision quest where it was taught by some Lakota elders for non-native people and native people. There was a mixture of people there, actually. But the way that they did this was, whereas in mine, I just flew out, was around some strangers. There was one guy running the show. 8 of us went up into the mountain and found our place, and then he was just checking up on us. And then, this was like a whole base camp, right? They not only when you do a quest in this tradition, you have to have somebody come with you as your like camp person who is like eating food for you, drinking water for you, like so that I got to just basically sit around and eat twice as much food and drink a lot of water and just be hanging out and like sending my vibes up to her on the hill, right?
Right.
Meanwhile, there's also all these other things. She had to bring 8 stones with her that would go into the lodge immediately when she came down, whenever that was, right? It's like a 4-day, 4-night thing, but barely ever does anybody actually stay up for that entirety, which is something I also didn't know until I was part of this community. Was like, that's just you have your vision at some point and then you can come down, and staying up there after you've already known that it's happened is not necessarily something that you have to force yourself to do if you feel like you've gotten full from what you came there to get, right? Um, so you have to bring 8 stones, and as soon as you come down, they do like a sweat lodge or whatever, and that also there's a sacred fire that's burning the entire time, um, you know, and so I had to be on fire watch shifts. I did like the midnight to 4 a.m. shift because I really liked just being up by myself around a fire. It was really nice.
Yeah.
And there's just food being made, and then people come, and so there's like a whole like village to come back to after the thing. It's just like a different experience. You have friends that that are there. It's not like and also just the intention that had to be set before even going out there. Like she had to make 400 prayer ties, like 400 little bundles of like, focused thought intention before going up there.
Yeah.
And it was just interesting to see like the contrast between those experiences and how much I pin and all of the different just in ritual in general for me is very communal or kin specific. So, there was I was a member of I don't know if member is the right word. I went to a sweat lodge that was a monthly sweat lodge from the time I was basically like 18 until 20. And oftentimes I would help fire tend there. But the thing is, I didn't really know any of the people other than the people whose property it was. And so I'd be in the lodge and people would be like, saying prayers and different things. And it was always like, I didn't give a shit. To put it lightly, like, I was like, who the fuck are these people? They have no connection to me. They're not my kin. I wish I was doing this with people who were my kin, and also it was eventually I stopped going in terms of the awkwardness of cultural appropriation with some of this stuff. It never sat right with me to be singing Lakota or Apache songs or something like that in a lodge where I didn't even know the words. Again, I think that there's like a weird, oh gosh, this is going to go into a whole bunch of other tangents, but there's like this weird like I think in like some cultures they have like coded specifically spiritual language, And in like the sort of zeitgeist of Native American spirituality or New Age spirituality, like different Native American languages have become like the coded spiritual languages for white people, if that makes
Totally,
sense. Super weird.
totally.
It never sat with me. Like, I want to be in a lodge where I actually understand the lyrics, in part because of the intention, right? Like, I want to actually know what's being said here, so I can feel it and envision it and actually experiencing it through my own perception
Right.
and language. But there was this really cool guy who was Mongolian ancestry, but had been adopted into Lakota culture, the Ghost Horse family. And he came and led a lodge there once. And he was just like, look, I know some of you are super uncomfortable because this is like a native language, but this is just the Lakota key. Once the door is open, like, it's your ancestors that are back there. It's not like you're calling in Lakota spirits. This is just like
Right.
the Lakota's key to open this door. And
Right.
they're sharing it with you, right? Um, and that made me feel okay about it for a little while longer. And then still, it was just like, no, because it's not holistic. It's
Right.
it's fragmented, right? I'm like picking and choosing these different fragmented pieces rather than developing something organically from my interaction with the landscape, right? So that key that was created came from a specific culture and specifically from their interaction from their landscape.
Totally.
And so if we're to create something again, to me, that's where it emerges from our relationship to the land.
Right.
And the problem is that, again, like this suspension, in the same way that social justice is like suspended, we don't have a relationship to the land. And when I say relationship, I mean like literally getting your food from the land with your own hands, with your community locally, right? Like like we're not just like living in excess, buying food from a grocery store that was manufactured by machines 1,000 miles away. Like, I don't think you can develop a spiritual relationship with your place through that, like,
Right.
um, through an intention. I think it actually, I mean, unless the intention is to subsist from a place, to actually be interacting with the species who you're killing to live, you have. So I don't know. I mean, it just becomes this challenge of like, to kind of circle it back to your question around ritual and rites of passage, like those to me right now, even the one that I was a part of with my friend Lisa, her vision quest, that was like 500 miles away from where we live. And even though I was there and there was a bit of our kinship, there, it was still this like makeshift group of people that don't know each other. um and I think that it's the same kind of thing, like when you go to the like if I go to pray or pay my respects or whatever, go to do sit spot sensory awareness with a particular piece of land, and it's different every time. It's the same thing. It's like, oh, I'm not really developing like a deep relationship with specific living creatures in this environment. And so it just becomes really challenging, I think, to have a holistic connection to place while we're being held in suspension through essentially global food systems,
Right. Totally. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that because it's like super real, because it's like people are going to hear this and they're going to be depressed, and I'm okay with that because I I live inside that depression and I find ways to still live in the sacred anyway. And I
Exactly.
think that this is really important because like land back is not going to happen probably within my lifetime. I wish it would, but it probably isn't. The other thing is that I'm probably not going to live in a place where I could actually have a stable enough, long enough, and a big enough community that we would be able to actually know things that are important. And those important things are kind of like what Tyson talks about. He's like, in this season, the eels are fat and you can kill them, and then the bark is like this, and that's fucking useful, important
Totally.
information.
Yes.
What we have here, and I'm going to just broadly, obviously there's lots of people here living in the woods in the Pacific Northwest, and I think it's great. I'm not one of those people. I'm kind of disabled. I don't know how to drive a car. I grew up poor in an urban environment, and that's just the reality I live in. And I can visit places. I can hike. I can go to water spots. I can give tobacco to trees in the park, and that's totally fine. And I think it's important. but I'm not fooling myself. I'm not
Totally.
fooling myself that me giving tobacco at the big ass oak tree in the park is actually going to give me the same set of conditions and perceptions and feelings that like some of my ancestors 10,000, 20,000, 2 million years ago felt. Because there's something about we are protected in a way that's not protection.
Totally.
We are protected by the fact that, like you said, I can just go to the grocery store and buy potatoes. I'm protected. I could
Yeah.
just be like, well, if this fucking community garden doesn't pan out, I can just go buy food.
Yep.
Now, I don't think that's necessarily the like evil, but I do think it has an unintended consequence, which is what we're talking about, which is people are so bereft and they're all like crying, oh my God, all the white people crying about how we don't have connection to the fucking land. And we don't want to give up our grocery stores.
Right. Exactly.
so
Yeah.
so we're both being blessed by something that our ancestors are like. Some of my ancestors are like, dude, don't fucking cry, just eat the fucking food. Like, shut the fuck up, pray to the food. Yes, you don't know it, it doesn't feel as good because you don't know it, but you have fucking food, so shut the fuck up. Right?
Yes.
There is a practicality to that kind of engagement. And I think this deep soul yearning that humans have, regardless of their ancestry, is a yearning to be interwoven with a non-human society in such a way that there is a kind of unbelievable breadth of like communication and like signal sharing. You know, um, like like we don't have communal sites where we can go and build a bonfire together and sing to the stars. And we don't have people tending those places who can tell us, okay, so the mushroom beings are over there today. And, like we don't have beings who are like liaisons between the non-humans and the humans who
Totally.
come to these like sacred sites. And I think what we're yearning for is that liaison experience, the experience that you could know something about the land that you're on in a way that is actually like beyond rational. Like
Totally.
it's not like a
Yeah.
kind of categorization of domination, rational explanation. It's like a kind of feeling of like, oh, I just have this feeling about the animal. I don't know. I just know the crow. I have a feeling because I've been here with the crows for 40 years, you know?
Yeah.
And I think we're in a particularly challenging time in our lives because I think, and I'd love to hear your feedback on this. I think we're being asked to behave in a sacred way anyway.
Right. Yeah.
Like yeah, you don't have the thing that makes you feel complete. You don't have the thing that makes you feel satisfied. You know that this is super fucked up and damaging. Blah 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 blah. Like you don't have all the things you want to have, and how are you going to behave?
Totally. Yeah.
And so that's the thing where I keep coming up to like, look, you got to kind of, it's not even, to me, it's not even act as if, it's just act in a way that you can respect. You know,
Right.
like
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
that, like you're like, yep, I don't have all this shit and I have to go to the grocery store and I can kind of nod my head and be like, damn, at the whole, you know,
It's
the thing.
interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, because I think, and this is where um, there's like a point of contention in my own psyche, right? There's
Totally.
there's two things happening. One is that like when I think about this stuff, I think about, well, it's not going to be this, the food's not going to be at the grocery store forever, right? And so there's this level of me then thinking about it as like prepping in a way, you know what I mean? Like I'm learning these things so that when there's no more food at the grocery store, but I think that's not like the that's still like this sort of logical linear thing that creates stagnation in thinking about it as prepping.
Yes.
And so what I want to think about it as, or how I try to perceive it through myself, is just always becoming human. Like every
Yes,
day I'm going to
totally.
wake up and I'm domesticated, but there's a wildness within me that wants to come out. And how can I embrace that wildness every moment that I'm alive within the confines that I exist? And in doing so, I will be preparing for a time when there isn't food in a sense, but like not in a intentional preparation way, but more in a how do I have the best lived human experience that I can have in this time that I'm alive in the framework in which I exist.
Totally.
And so I don't know, and it's challenging because I think so much of the origin of my own personal journey wasn't centered around that per se. I think the yearning for it is what catalyzes most people,
Yes.
but the like fear of collapse is in a large part of what was a motivating factor. And I think that that fear gets in the way of embracing the moment oftentimes, and embracing the like the letting the wildness come out,
Yes.
and not necessarily planning for something, but just trusting. This is what, somebody was like, asking me about collapse and why am I not afraid of it. And I say, well, I trust in the process, and that to me is like, it's not that I feel that way all the time. It's that I'm constantly having to remind myself, no, trust in the process, trust in the process. And what that means is just embrace wildness and don't fret. Another time somebody asked me like, well, what if you build your permaculture village and then somebody with guns comes along and takes it? And I'm like, good. Like then somebody else will be reaping the benefits of something that I did for the future of humans. But it also doesn't mean that I'm just going to like stand down and let people take my shit
Totally.
without a fight. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, but there's a framework around like a lot of that fear of prepping that is based around like all of the bad things that can happen, rather like embracing the great things about what it is to embrace wildness.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think you're talking about what it's like when there are times in our lives, and hopefully this doesn't happen only when someone's about to die, but it usually does happen when someone is dying, in which like we recognize that all of our reaching and striving and like conditionality, which is like, in order to feel good, I need to do this first, right? Like a kind of placing like, well, if I don't do this, then I can't have that, which is really
Totally.
like a kind of like, well, you could have that and do this. And it's kind of like it's a cooperative moment, right? But I think that when we come into contact with disease, disability, um, death, dying processes, things like collapse in any term, like in the widest terminology, we could say like decay or
Totally.
composting or something. I think that when we engage with that process in a way that isn't necessarily trying to avoid it or resist it, because we kind of have to notice that we want to avoid it and resist it and then do it anyway. We actually start to realize that like kindness and generosity and this kind of present moment presence that you're talking about, which is like, no, the wildness exists right now. How do I let it sort of either emerge or just actually be what it actually is?
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not trying to repress it or shape it into some form. I'm actually locating it and saying, oh, hey, do you have enough food to eat? Like there's a way in which like it's cooperative rather than domineering. Totally. And it can happen in any moment. It's just weird that we live in such a society where the cultural myths are so stagnant and strong that it takes these fucking weird shocks to get people to kind of just wake up and go, oh, I could have been living my whole life this whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Like I could have just been having a feeling this whole time that was like not depression. Like
mm-hmm.
It's very real that like, animism, for whatever maligned, weird form of name, because animism is like a construct
Sure.
too. Like, what the
Yep.
fuck is animism?
Yep.
Like, it's like, oh, it's just a way to describe this kind of wild inter-elasticity that's happening, right? But I like to say animism because it gives me a little thing, and I go animism, animism. but really, like, animism to me is like, a lot of what spiritual traditions teach, like not just the Lakota, but like a lot of Eastern traditions and a lot of old pagan traditions. It's kind of like, oh, you go like lay on the ground naked.
Yes,
like,
exactly.
And you like breathe and you look at the stars and you really have like a fucking experience. And you're like, oh yeah, I'm connected to this kind of like wider body of like impossibility that is like allowing me to breathe. And, it sounds silly now because of mindfulness has been co-opted, by all
Hmm.
of these things. But like, I just, I'm trying to, in my own kind of contention, understand the almost like tragedy of the human project. But the tragedy is also like held by this kind of sacred presence feeling of like, hey, in this moment right now, in all the fucking bullshit that's going on that we don't like and that we're kind of like, no, that's not cool. I can still, and this is the thing, is like no one can do it for us, right? That's the other thing, is like nobody can do this for me. Only I can like look at my own resistance and go, I'm going to be the best human I can be today. I'm going to try to become more real today in this moment or whatever. And that is, I think, like when people go, but I don't know how, it's like, I think that's the weird thing that we're coming up against. And maybe it's even why you and I are in this fucking weird business. Like, why the fuck are we, who are like, generally, we are young people. Like, I'm about to turn 42. I'm a stupid idiot. Like, I'm a very naive and battered person. And I'm still showing up and being like, okay, let's practice together, and like I'll pretend that I'm a teacher and you all, but there is
Hmm.
something to being like, well, if not me, then who? Because everyone needs to do it. And
Totally.
I would love to get to a place where I'm technically out of a job because everyone's just kind of doing it.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
everyone's just kind of like trying to be the best I can be, like but I do think there is a kind of educational, and I'd love to just hear your thoughts on where you are in that, like, because you're still educating people, you're reading your book, you have a Patreon, like it's great, like you have podcasts. I think I want everyone to like tune in, but like how are you sort of holding your path of like education, and do you even think that you're educating? Like what is it that you even think that you're doing, you know
Yeah, no, that's good. I know it's funny because I'm always trying to figure out, what it is, what it is that I do,
yeah, totally.
and how to identify myself when people are like, so what, what are you? What do
Yeah,
you do?
yeah,
Right now I'm just calling myself a historian.
oh good, yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's one of the things that I've been saying a lot lately. I'm just a historian, but uh, it's super complex, right? So I think in the early aughts, I was still very much into filmmaking, which was my childhood passion, and I got into I ran away from home, went to learn wilderness survival skills, etc. Thought that civilization was going to collapse and that there would be no film industry and that there
Oh
was,
yeah.
it was useless to learn any of that kind of stuff. And then that didn't happen, and I started to get into Joseph Campbell's work and the power of myth, and from there was able to sort of understand that storytelling was a central component to cultural transformation. It's ironic because I feel like I am like on the surface almost a determinist in the stories that I tell, but at the same time it's like, well, then why the fuck am I telling stories if I'm a determinist, if I think that it's all just material, like so
Yeah,
clearly I'm not at all, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But when I talk about things, I tend to kind of lean in two different directions with that. But so in the early aughts, I created this character called Urban Scout, which was like this fictionalized character of a person living as a hunter gatherer in the city of Portland. And I wrote like a short screenplay for it. We filmed it. At the same time, I was like, uh, we wanted to create buzz for the character. So I like, this was back when like Friendster and MySpace had like just started, right? And
Yeah.
so I created like a profile for Urban Scout, like on Friendster and on MySpace. And so did like photo shoots, and then like, oh, what are his favorite movies? And so it was this
Yeah.
multimedia art piece, right? So on a core level, like I hate calling myself a storyteller or an artist, which is why I feel like historian is sort of where I've landed with a lot of it. But
Sure.
I'm basically an artist, and my mediums change from time to time. So during that era, I was much more performative, although I still consider, the sort of brand of what I do now in terms of my teaching performance art. Even though a lecture is considered this sort of academic intellectual kind of thing, to me it's still just performance art. That's how I that's how I look at it. But what happened was one day I was walking around as this character, because I would go out in character without a camera or anything, just to feel the muse and be like, what is this character? What is this experience of this person? What happens to them on a day-to-day basis when they're out in the world? And taking from those real life interactions that I had with people and applying that to some of the development of the character. But so one day I'm out there and I'm walking around. I was walking up. Oh, I think I heard the robot thing. Maybe no.
Oh, is it the robot?
I don't know. I heard myself echoing and then a robot-y technical sound thing.
Anyway, okay.
Okay, cool. So I'm walking up Hawthorne and I'm wearing so the Urban Scout character is wearing a loincloth, is covered in bad camo. Essentially he's like a clown of rewilding, right?
Totally.
And it took me a while to figure out that's because it was a comedy. It wasn't sincere, right? I mean, it was sincere, but tragically sincere,
Yes,
right?
yes, totally.
In the sense of a comedy. So I was basically like a clown of my own ideas and my own perception and my own dreams. And I'm walking down the street in a loincloth covered in ridiculous camouflage, just mud or whatever. And I've got my bow drill with me, and I would wear Converse. It's like the one article of contemporary clothing. And I had a bone knife, and the loincloth was made out of a bike tube for the belt and a piece of dumpster dived wool for the cloth, and and a bandana. I'd have a red or black bandana. And this Jeep screeches and this guy jumps out and he runs up to me. He's like, "What's going on with you, man? Are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm fine. What do you mean?" And he's like, "Well, why are you dressed like this? What's up?" And I was like, "Oh, well, I'm an urban hunter gatherer. I'm a preemptive post-apocalyptic anarcho neo-paleoist. I believe that civilization is going to collapse in my lifetime, so I'm living as though it's already happened, so that when it does, it won't affect me." And he was just like, "Oh my God, this is insane. This is so cool. Do you teach classes? Do you how do I this is brilliant, And I was like, "Well, yeah, check me out on MySpace." It's just and so he drove away and he was just so excited that the possibility that this thing was real,
Mm-hmm.
And I just as I started walking downtown to do my performance stuff, my heart just sunk, and I was like, this is actually who I want to be. This is what I want to have. This is the reality I want to live. And so I shifted gears from, people started calling me Urban Scout just because they saw I didn't have a personal Friendster or MySpace, and I'd meet people and they'd be like, "Oh, you're Urban Scout. Yeah, I saw you on MySpace," or whatever, right? And then the movie came out and we had a premiere at a venue in Portland and people came, and it was sort of a big party and stuff. But at that point, it sort of transitioned into this sort of blogging. Well, what I wanted to do was actually try to live as Urban Scout and embrace that persona. And so I tried and failed miserably, immediately, because number one, I didn't have the skills. But number two, I realized that more people needed to be on board, right? That there was this earlier dream of me having a group of people doing a sort of, hunter-gatherers, whatever you want to call it, existence. And that it was actually not possible for me to do solo on my own, not just because I don't have the skills individually, but because I'm a fucking super social person, right? Yeah. And so at that point, I transferred over the character to this blogging persona that became a writer to write about these ideas, to try to convince people essentially to join my group to live as an urban hunter-gatherer, right? Which eventually became Rewild Portland, which is the organization that I run now, and so it's just an interesting sort of it's the same creature, but it's just been mutating all these years into different things and to serve different purposes and to reach different audiences. So Urban Scout, the character, the fictionalized character in the movie, was different from the persona of Urban Scout that I turned into as a blogger, who was very, iconoclastic, sort of like a George Carlin, abrasive humor. I burned a lot of bridges. I wrote a lot
totally.
of I wrote a really shitty essay that was an open letter to the city repair project that was just not cool. I mean, it's basically cancel, but of that caliber, but before cancel culture was a thing. It was more partly tongue in cheek, you know what I mean? Like criticism, but also really fucking rude,
Yeah,
sort of
yeah,
like Raphael of the Ninja Turtles or something, you know
yeah,
what I mean? Like,
totally.
but that wasn't going to translate over to creating a community, right? That's like a funny thing for an individual to do. It got
Totally.
me a lot of media attention because they love narcissistic personas, right?
Yeah,
And
sure.
so I was like written about in all these different things. And I just realized it wasn't accomplishing what I needed it to. And so then I had to morph it again.
Yeah,
And that's when I became more into, I think, myself, being able to sort of put that muse aside and find other muses that allowed me um, to sort of, fruit into this thing that exists now. And who knows where it'll go from here. But to say, what am I? I mean, on a core level, I'm a fucking performance artist.
yeah, totally, totally.
um,
I
and
love
a
it.
community organizer. Like I'm a
Yeah, yeah,
performance
yeah,
artist with whose intention is community organization.
totally. Yeah,
Um, and I think that is definitely what I've always been. I love bringing people together, and there was another thing I did before Urban Scout. This sort of like proto Urban Scout. When I dropped out of high school, there was no. I was into filmmaking, and so I was like, how am I going to keep learning and getting better with film and not go to film school? And it was right after like Fight Club had come out, and so I was like, we should start like a video club, that's like Fight Club but with filmmaking or something. It's so stupid. By the way, I tried to watch Fight Club last night when I had my migraine and I popped some ibuprofen and I laid down. I was like, oh, Fight Club. It just popped up in my thing. I'm like, is this still good? And I watched it. And I immediately fell asleep. I was like, this movie sucks.
yeah. It's
But
totally bad.
it was so
Yeah,
cool back then or whatever,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Um,
It has not aged well.
no, no, not at all.
Oh.
But yeah, so we started like this video, a filmmaking club, basically like an open mic, but for filmmaking in the basement of an anarchist collective in downtown Portland that looked like the Fight Club basement. But to promote it, we did this thing where I dressed up in a sarong, which is probably like racist.
Yeah, probably.
I mean, like, even just now, I'm like, I don't know anything about I actually don't know what that even is really, but I think we were like mocking, like Hare Krishnas or something along those lines. Like we were trying to simulate that sort of like weird, or foreign, I should say, like cult aesthetic of like a religion that's
Yeah,
foreign to the United States or whatever. And like I said, I was like 17 or something, so I didn't know shit
right.
about that, and I still don't really. But we went down to the Pioneer Square and pretended that we were like an occult that worshipped television and worshipped the media, and our was like screaming on the corner, like while handing out flyers that had nothing to do with what we were actually screaming about. It was like nobody came. It's just an absurd thing, but it was just like I think there was like an adrenaline rush that I really got from public performance back then. I don't get it now because I'm not avant-garde in the way that I was.
Yeah.
Um, but I just think those moments of like of performance have always been with me even throughout childhood. And um yeah, I don't know, so that's to me, I think. I don't know, I forget what your original
It's
question was, but
okay.
what do I do? How do I perceive
Yeah,
of as teaching? Am I a
yeah,
teacher? Yes, I think I am a teacher, but and again, I think Daniel Quinn's work obviously was, I don't know if I've mentioned this, but completely fundamental to my everything. And so when I was 16 and I dropped out of high school, ran away from home, like I read all of his books, and the story of B was definitely the most impactful because at the end of that book, the last sentence of the narrator becoming the person, the message, right? Like he's become the message. And I just immediately was like, I'm the message now, and that's my fucking whole purpose in life.
yeah.
And so
Mhm.
I think on a level, that's really how I perceive of myself, is like just to be a medium for this deeper messages that need to be out in the world. And I
Totally.
go through phases where I recoil, and
Yeah.
I
Sure,
become
sure.
reclusive, and I get tired of it and exhausted, and I break away, and I think I'm never doing this again. And then somebody says something like, well, back when we were all cavemen, blah, blah, blah. And it just like that internal angst prevents me from stepping away.
Yeah, sure, sure.
Anyway.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think, there's a lot of cool stuff in there. I don't need to like analyze your life story because I think that life stories are vision quests in a sense because
Mm,
we are trying to sort of live a dream that's almost like inherent within us, but we cannot name it. The only way we can name it is to sort of like have enough fucking experiences that it gets maybe a little clearer as we have those experiences. Like we basically have to make mistakes to know that they're
Totally.
mistakes. Like we
Exactly.
can't, like there's no way that we can know what enough is until we do too much or too
Totally.
little, right?
Yeah.
Like there is a way in
Yeah.
which like learning is a process of that, overstepping thresholds that we don't even perceive, you know, and
Exactly.
we have to kind of like do that and then go, oh fuck, that was a thing and that had consequences, and we
Yeah.
learn from it. But what I'm really hearing, and which, you know, something I've been thinking about a lot, is like, you know, dreams and stories, and that, you know, dreams and stories are sort of like these very strange messages from the world or the ancestors or whatever you want to say, like the body that is not an individual choice making machine, you know, like these kind of inspirational urges that don't make much rational sense, and yet they get us out of bed, you know, like we
Totally.
don't have these you know, like it's not enough to just eat and procreate or whatever, or like have sex, whether it's procreative or not, but like it's not enough to like get out of bed is just to eat and like have sex. It's not enough. You
Right.
know, it's really not
It's
enough.
not.
We need these sort of artistic urges and these strange cravings that are sort of like very hard to pin down. And I do think that like I do feel particularly strongly towards like theater, ritual, and storytelling and art making. And you know, you can mutate it all in all the ways. Like in fact, it is the kind of mutational process itself, like the ability to sort of take an emotion and turn it into a project, like what you just talked about, is like you had a kind of emotional response to a story, and it has sort of changed itself through you over the course of decades, and it's still doing that.
Right.
It's still changing, and it's still carrying you. And I do feel like, you know, that stewardship is potentially what an educator does. Like an educator isn't just about sort of giving you knowledge to memorize, but is more like an evocateur,
Mm.
like trying to evoke within the other a sense of their own longing that is not predictable by other, you know, like you can't predict
Totally.
what another person is hungry for, like sculpture or dance. Like it's not so catchable. Like you can't hook it. It's not a fish you can catch,
Exactly.
really, you know?
Exactly.
Um, like trying to grab water, it doesn't
Mm.
work. Like,
Mm.
you know, you're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, it doesn't work. But I do feel that, like, you know, part of, and I want to tie this back to the theme, it's like land acknowledgement is a kind of story container in which currently it's about white people with money or organizations with money being guilt tripped into saying things they don't feel comfortable saying, as a kind
Totally.
of like almost like, oh, read these 3 pages out of this random book. Okay, well, I don't like these words, but I'm forced to read them. So we have a kind of weird script reading, right? It's like a
Yeah.
cold reading. Like you watch a lot of people up on stage doing their land acknowledgement. It's like a cold read. It's
Totally.
very stilted and uncomfortable, and everyone's anus is tight, and you know, like people are like, ah, you
Yeah.
know. So there's that version of land acknowledgement, which is a kind of like, I guess it's kind of an icebreaker, and I'm okay with that. I'm not anti it, but I'm interested in the stories that we would be telling if we weren't guilt shaming each other into telling them.
Right.
Like why can't we have land acknowledgement that is about how happy you are to fucking be alive, or like how wonderful it is to hear the crows outside or the rain falling, or you know, those are stories that actually bring us together as a people, regardless of our cultural traumas, you know, like regardless. And, you know, I'm sort of invoking that, but I'm also like going beyond just the storytelling aspect, which I think that you might help people get, is the hands-on nature of it all. Can
Totally.
you speak a little bit about like going from story to something that is more tangible? Like I know story is tangible, but there is something about like working with
Absolutely.
your hands and like
Absolutely.
the skill building process of like making a story real in the body.
Totally. Yeah. Well, it makes me think of a couple of things. One is when I was a teenager, I was introduced to the Haudenosaunee's Thanksgiving address, which there's a really beautiful chapter in Braiding Sweetgrass that where she covers kind of some of the meanings of it and goes through the whole thing. I learned about it, at 16 and incorporated it into a lot of my animist sort of perspective on relations. And it makes me think of land acknowledgement as, when you were saying like, feeling good about being alive and stuff. Like the Thanksgiving address to me was always this deep appreciation and gratitude for being alive and for all the other living things that are alive as well. And it would be an interesting sort of thing to incorporate that into a land acknowledgement, not as the land, not and not in a guilt tribute kind of way, but just in a gratitude, from a place of gratitude. Um, because I think that land acknowledgement really, the guilt is that we're living in this frozen culture of occupation and there's fucking nothing we can do about it, right? So why are we, by bringing it up, we're just like, hey, isn't this just fucked up? And you're like, yeah, I guess this is all fucked up and I should feel bad about it because it's my ancestors' fault. So yeah, I guess we're just gonna sit here and feel fucked up about it and do nothing about it,
Right, right,
because
right.
what
Totally.
do? Dismantle the state, you know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like
that's the answer.
that's the answer, but we can't, I mean, we can try anyway. But in terms of embodiment, to me, people are like, what are some things you can start to rewild, and I fucking hate answering that question because it's so prescriptive and everybody's so individualistic. It's like you're saying, it's like trying to pick up water or like catch a fish or something. Like, I don't want to tell people what to do, but I want to tell this story and then they can take action from it. But there is this experience of, I go back and forth again from this like materialist determinist perspective and the storytelling one, right? Where it's a constant argument in my head of like, which one is more important, telling people these things and writing a book or just getting people out fucking side and doing shit with their hands with plants. You know what I mean? Like, and I just go back and forth all the time because like, and the reality is it's a beautiful mixture of both of those things, right?
Yeah, of course.
But I have, yeah, but I just have this constant argument that that'll never reconcile in my head, even though I know that it's just an ebb and flow and that they're interrelated. But I think when we were talking about having a relationship with place, and to me, that means really subsisting from a place. It's the physical interactions that you're having in that landscape. It's the killing of other things. It's the it's really the disturbances, embracing the disturbances that we create as animals,
Yes.
and then being able to recognize that we can have a regenerative response, or that we can be thinking about the way that we disturb things to make them regenerative, right? And so that's a great theory, but then what does that look like in practice? Well, for me, it comes down to my weaving practice. I'm a basket weaver and I weave with invasive species. I don't believe the concept of invasive species is complete bullshit.
Yeah,
It's
it's
it's a
total
it's a
bullshit. It's
fabrication. It's
total
complete
nonsense.
fabrication. That's
Yeah,
not to say that these aren't prolific species, but they're
right.
prolific because of the conditions that they're adapted to disturbance and the disturbances that were created by civilization. So if anything is invasive, it's the colonial society, not the plants, right? Or the
Yes,
animals that have come in
totally.
their place.
Yeah.
Um, so in thinking about that, like then how do we embrace or re-embrace these species and recognize that they're prolific, and in part they have no predation. So you know by becoming a predator of English ivy, I'm also like expressing my love for the ivy in a sense, because I mean I love it. And when people talk shit and talk about how it's an invasive species, it actually boils my blood. Like it actually, like I'll get really pissed off when if I let myself, right? Obviously there's the angst.
Yeah, of
There's
course,
the
of
angst
course.
that I'm balancing out. But right. But so for me to work with this plant and to disturb its existence and recognize that it's also here because of the civilizational disturbance, I'm engaging with that disturbance in a way that's again, I think it's embracing the humanness of it. I don't have to think about it. My hands are like, I think of my hands as almost they have their own mind,
Yes,
and they
they
have their
do.
own
Yeah.
desires. And so if when I'm weaving, I feel like my whole being is in line with with an ecosystem, because I'm moving my body. Like weaving kind of turns my brain off in a way. um, I feel the embodiment of my hands doing the work. They're doing the thinking, the pattern recognition. I can weave blindfolded, like, and I've done it just because it's fun. um,
Hmm.
but and then I'm also interacting with this other species, and we're together creating this thing that is then going to help me interact more with my landscape through the thing that I produced, which is the end goal of the basket, right? Um, it's hard to even put into words what it feels like, because it's not even like organizing chaos. It's its own form of chaos, but it's a differently differently organized.
Totally.
um and so that's one of those things that I love to. And it's hard to learn a new skill. So learning basket weaving is different from weaving. Like, when I have a lot of practices, when I teach basket weaving, it's more about a practice of mindfulness or mindlessness. Now, a lot
Yeah.
of people are
Yeah.
starting
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
say that instead, and I like that too. But,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, it's a practice of feeling embodied, letting your thoughts go away, and the Dushan Smile.
Oh no, what is
So
it?
I've been like researching, like different health and practices of just to work with my depression, understand the physiological aspects that can diminish depression.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they did a study on was this thing called the Dushan Smile, which is like when you smile with the eyes. So the
Oh
grin
yeah.
the
Yeah.
grin is so much that your eyes end up smiling too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But you can have the same effect by just biting on a pencil, like
Oh
putting a
totally.
pencil across the
Yeah.
mouth, right?
Yeah.
And so they did this study where they wanted to check, like, hormone levels, stress levels, anxiety. So they had people just, they didn't tell them what the study was for, and they had them just bite on a pencil. And what they found was that by just biting on the pencil, the physiological response of having the Dushan
Oh
smile
totally.
form
Yeah.
actually reduced their stress, right?
Yeah.
Now, then they told another group, this will reduce your stress if you do this, if you smile like this. And they had an even bigger reduction in stress, right? Because
Right.
there's an intent along with the physiological response and these different things that are happening, right?
Totally.
So I was reading about this, but what's funny about it is that I was already an accidental practice of mine where, and in part because my basket weaving teachers are like, you don't swear when you're weaving, because you'll weave in like the negative energy
Oh
into your
right.
basket, right?
Right. Right. Right.
And so, and be peaceful, like get up, like if take a break from weaving, get up, stretch, like just really be in your body while you're weaving, right? And so now when I'm weaving, I'll just unconsciously notice, like, oh, I'm smiling, like I'm like in this
Yeah.
mode, and it's
Yeah.
just happening. So when I was reading about the studies of the Duchenne smile, it's like, it's funny because now I hate it when I see people just like smiling, like, and because I'm in a depression and I'm angsty, and the idea of smiling, I'm like, fuck you and your smile, but but I know now that just smiling actually will diminish my depression and manage some of my angst, right? So like, especially when I'm driving and I start to feel the like road rage impulse, I'll be like, I'm just gonna smile. I have to smile. And so I'm just smiling, and I'm just like, I feel like such a jerk, a fucking asshole, and I smile, and I'm driving along, and I'm just,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but like a minute goes by, and I'm like, and I feel the results of it, and it makes me so annoyed, but also I'm laughing at it. So then the smile is more authentic because I'm laughing at how ridiculous I feel I look, and it's just
Right.
this,
Yeah.
and it's a really positive, it's a
Right.
positive and annoying thing, right?
Totally.
Um, but there's just so many of those kinds of things with um, ancestral skills, and
Hmm.
how we evolved using our hands in these ways to make and craft extensions of ourselves. And
Right.
I think that's the component here, is that there's a lot of interesting theories, around thoughts, and how um, certain animals may, because they don't necessarily think the way that humans do, that they don't see themselves as separate from their prey or predator, and that it's actually like a from the perception, all sort of one thing. This is definitely something more along the lines of like the thermodynamics of
Oh
emotion,
yeah,
and a
totally.
lot of that kind of
Yeah.
symposium. They talk about a lot of this stuff there, right? Um, but when humans started using stone tools, people are like, well, humans don't have canines, so we're not predators. We are herbivores or something, right? And it's like, well, no, we didn't evolve canines. We evolved technologically instead of biologically. And so those technologies are an extension of the self. The technology that we've created is like, we don't grow fangs, we make them
Make them, yeah. Right.
with elements from the environment that become an extension of the body.
Totally.
Like an atlatl is basically a
Totally.
longer arm that gets
Yep.
thrown. And we oftentimes will not even recognize how much of an extension the things that we are in are a sense of ourselves. Like an example I see of this is when people are driving and they'll say like, oh, that person almost hit me,
Right.
but
It's
they're
not
talking about
you.
the car,
It's the car.
right?
Yeah, totally.
But when you're the operator, the car
Yep.
becomes an extension of your body.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's this, and the hands are intelligent in that way. The hands are that grasping thing that extends out who we are into these other than human quote unquote objects,
Totally.
that then become a part of us temporarily. And so, yeah, I think that is a way of really kind of circumventing the story mind and getting people to be experiencing animism through the embodiment of their hands and other things, right? So it's not just this, analytical or imaginative type of perspective, but actually a felt experience.
Right.
And it's actually something that when I was still doing my Rewilding 101 classes in person, I realized that I wasn't doing that. And that was like kind of detrimental to the class because we were exiting the class still in our heads almost completely. And so it was causing some people emotional pain.
Yeah, sure, sure.
And so I started a fifth day where we were actually like on the land doing shit,
Mhm.
And it really transformed the class a lot. And so I kind of have, unfortunately with the pandemic, things have moved online to Zoom. And I found other ways to
Mm,
diminish that sort of headiness
sure.
through that platform. But yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, these are some of the things that I have to like contend with too, which is why lately we've been integrating into all of our sort of meditation or like embodiment practices, which include, like Taoism is inner smile. That's
Totally.
like a core component of like Eastern meditation is to
Mm.
actually like slightly lift up the sides of your mouth.
Hmm.
Because they understand it's like, no, it's neurophysiological. Who gives a
Totally.
shit? Like
Yeah.
they don't care. It's like
Yep.
pragmatic.
Yep. Exactly.
But I do think that like, we interact a lot. Obviously we're interacting with computers, but it's not the same as sort of like crafting objects that you have to use to survive, like gardening implements and farming implements that you actually have to make, and then you use those to do other things. And like there's a kind of chain of limb, that happens with tool making, right? And tool making is like varied because if you look at the tools for any craft, they're very specified. They're really interesting. Like bonsai tools are
Mm.
very specific, and then there's paper making tools are very specific. So really, we do make these tools. But what's interesting to me about like the kind of, maybe we can call it trauma remediation or transformation that we're trying to do with the sort of angst and the depression that we're all living in because we're so fucking deeply unsatisfied with our situation, is to get people in between every sort of visualization or imagination or somatic experience that they're doing, is to kind of immediately go, okay, now write a poem about that. It doesn't have to be good. Draw a picture about that. It doesn't have to be good. Have a gestural dance about that.
Mm.
So that there's some way in which we go, oh my God, I just got this information. I'm perceiving some kind of information and I'm narrativizing it, is to go, okay, now do something with it that is immediately sort of like translating it into another medium. Because if we wait too long, some weird stuff seems to happen. Like there's a kind of strange quality of like living in the head where you have all these stories, but your body is kind of atrophied because there's no translation of transmission to expression, right?
Totally.
There's a kind of like, oh, I just downloaded all this information, but like you're not sort of going, okay, so now how does that change the way I walk? Or can I cook? Like, what would the cooking feel like if I cooked with this embodiment? You know, like how do I spread the butter on the toast? You know, all of that becomes slightly different but you have to actually make it. It's not necessarily automatic.
Totally.
Only because we're living in such a decontextualized culture where we're not seeing people use their hands like anymore. Like I'm not seeing people carving or, you know, like, but if you go to another country, you actually do see that still. You see people like carving wood and it's like, oh, that's the wood carver. I'm like, oh shit. Like, you know, like that person is literally like using their hands all day in public and people are like, oh, they see it, right? Or you see people in the rice fields or farming and you're like, wait, that's happening in the, right? Like it's not separate from.
Totally.
And so we live in this highly segregated culture in which like we're sort of interacting with words, not necessarily hearing people speak them, seeing their tongue move. We're not seeing the storyteller's lips anymore. And we're also not seeing the writer write. Well, so we're not even seeing the crafting, we're seeing the after image of the crafting.
Yeah.
Right. And so part of it is this like the return to the non-edited process, right? Like part of what I'm doing with this podcast is I'm showing it and I'm not editing any of it. I'm actually showing two people talking and it's side by side on a screen and you actually get to watch facial expressions and like body movements and like hand gestures and none of it's edited, which we see so much hyper editing now.
Totally.
It's like we edit out people breathing because somehow we had to save 0.5 of a second.
Right.
Because somehow videos, you know, like, no, just like give me the whole fucking thing.
Yeah.
And I have to digest it, you know. But I do feel that like we have, and you know, personally, I are missing out on a kind of craftsmanship quality of our sense making, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
Of like actual sense making is not up here. Sense making only happens when we have this continual kind of food to mouth kind of like thing where it's like, oh, my toes and my fingers and my mouth and my tongue and my articulations are all actually in it.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
Like in the meat of the world, right? Like where, you know, and you see it too, like the resurgence in the last 10 years of people doing like butchering at home, like the whole paleo thing, but it's like, but like actually, and I've taken some of those classes, actually butchering is really engaging.
Oh yeah. No, it's amazing.
It's like this sinew and I cut it just like this and then I have to peel that and it's like super freaking engaging.
When I was single, I had like an OkCupid profile and it was like, what, you know, I think they had a thing on there that was like, what's one thing you are afraid to admit to other people? And I had this long thing of like, I love butchering animals. And I went in through like the feeling of peeling the skin back and, you know, separating the membrane layer. And it was just like this like long paragraph describing it. And I just was like, you know what, this is my litmus test.
Yeah, totally.
So,
right. It's both performance art and a real relational.
Yeah, right,
like,
exactly.
It's a relational like
yes.
gift because like on some level, like the poetry of those things has been lost because of our need to sanitize everything, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
But to be completely honest, like we would probably all be more nourished by like if we went to the grocery store and we pay the money for food, but we have to do some of the processing ourselves.
Exactly.
Like imagine if the produce workers didn't sort of clean and place the fruit in the basket for us. We just walked into a giant hallway of like things and and you get to pick it and clean it. And then when you bring it to the counter and then you pay for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, like, I mean, that's what it was like, right? Before.
That's what it used to be like, right? Like that's what farmers markets kind of used to be, but now it's all like pre-prepared, right?
Yep.
And we are kind of, we're kind of getting away from the sort of joy of having to clean and process, um, our sustenance.
Yeah.
Like it's really real that like I'm happy for disabled people and for older people because it's really useful, but for the rest of us, it's actually a kind of exercise to do that. Like we actually
Absolutely.
need to engage those musculatures and those nerve endings. And it's just another thought to throw in the pot of like we're not there, but maybe if we can start reminding people of how fun it might actually be to be there. Like instead of like a guilt trip and instead of like a sadness that, oh, I'm grieving the loss of something, I don't
Hmm.
really want to do that. I really want to say like, well, isn't it really interesting? Isn't it really
Exactly.
fun to like really feel something?
Totally.
That kind
Yeah.
of thing. So that's kind of where
Yeah.
I'm at with the whole thing. I mean, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you, Timothy.
You too.
I really hope that there's a part two or something. I don't know what's going to come out of this miniseries, but I'm definitely talking to a lot of interesting folks that I would love to see talk to each other. So I'm just seeding the possibility that, like, we can do some kind of panel discussion or something, because I
Mm.
really do think that, like, when we break out of the mode of dyadic or even small groups, there is a real there's a magic to actually like kicking your ideas around with other people who are also kicking around their ideas. And so
Totally.
I'm really hopeful that in 2022, we will all get a chance to really sort of chew on these things in a more, I don't know, in a more embodied way. But even if it's online, I'm okay with that too, as long as there's, like, I'm interested in the stewardship and curation of community in the now. Like, what is community now that we're all on fucking Zoom? Like, it's a real question,
Totally.
real
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, is there anything you'd
Awesome.
like to sort of end with today that maybe you haven't said, or maybe you want to plug, or maybe you just want to sort of give a shout out to some people that you're really paying attention to right now?
Hmm. Well, first, just yeah, thanks for having me on. This has been super fun. Um, yeah, I think yeah, like you already mentioned it, The Dawn of Everything, the David Graeber, David Wengrow book is something that I'm anticipating I'm going to both love and hate.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
um, and I'm in the middle of Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Tsing, which is really good, and it's been recommended to me for years. And I've read some of her other essays, and I just really appreciate her work. And I think it really relates back to a lot of this idea of subsisting from place and living in and being in relationship to the disturbance or the disturbed areas of civilization. And that's the whole premise of her book is, I think, the subtitle is like living in the ruins of the aftermath of capitalism or something
Yeah,
like that,
sure, sure.
or the possibility of life in the ruins of capitalism.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, those, and then of course, yeah, I just read Tyson's book or listened to his audiobook. Those are the sort of folks I'm thinking about a lot right now, as I kind of have to recraft what and dial in what rewilding really means as I'm working on my book. So,
Mhm. Yeah.
um,
Well,
it's hard when it's things that you've been thinking about for years just continuously change.
totally. No, I get it.
So yeah, and I guess I've got a Patreon. I'm reading aloud the Rewild or Die on my Patreon to patrons, and kind of going through. That's a book I wrote 15 years ago, and I'm just going through and making fun of myself a little bit, and correcting some things, and honoring some things, and
Mhm.
just giving a deeper perspective of where I'm at now. Like I said, as I work on this other book that I'll probably in 15 years from now be doing another
Yeah.
sort of thing,
Also,
another retrospective correction.
totally, of course. Yeah,
So
that's how it
yeah,
works.
yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm going to put all those things in the show notes, and hopefully we can just be in touch because, like, I think the living conversation is really important. That's why I'm doing these podcasts. Is that like I'm really interested in like getting into process and the inspirational process with folks, and it's like what I miss most about the sort of pre-COVID world, which really was dying anyway in some way, but
Sure.
whatever,
Yeah.
but was like the kind of brainstorming process that you can sometimes have with other artists where
Yep.
like you're not competing because you're both researching.
Exactly.
Like
Yep.
different artists researching together
Totally.
and then sort of like performing experiments for each other and trying to get feedback, like
Yeah.
it's a real, like, I don't know what I'm doing. I think I'm doing this. How do you feel about it? So that's the kind
Yeah.
of animist, like what animist arts seems to be becoming is something in which trauma healing and skill building is a sort of container for this larger kind of like I guess I could say like indigenous research or like conversation as research kind of artistic process of like crafting and recrafting our lives in this state, in this state asylum that we're all kind of like watching it fall apart.
Right.
And it's like, well,
Yeah.
the giant is like drooling, the
Mhm.
giant is angry, but they're also like falling apart, like it's very
Mhm.
real that like there's a kind of weird like caring for your jailer kind of feeling.
Right. Yeah.
Like
Totally.
like your jailer is actually like sicker every day, and you're kind of like, oh man, do you need to rest, buddy? Like it's
Right.
getting to that point
Yeah.
where it's like, oh yeah, like you've been mean to me, but like you ain't looking so well.
Yeah.
So there's this feeling I have about telling those kinds of stories in a really kind of both overtly but also covertly, because I do think that like sometimes subtext is much more impactful.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
cool. Well, blessings to the land that we're on, so-called Portland, Oregon, and all the creatures and the crows and the rain that like feed us, that nourish us. And I'm just going to continue talking stupid, and hopefully
Me
people will
too.
join me. And Peter, it's been such a pleasure. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Awesome.
But thanks
Cool.
everyone for watching, and stay tuned because there's more.